Um, but first, I just wanted to leave a few notes or share a few notes about access. Um, so first of all, we have Corvin doing manual transcriptions. Thank you so much. We are really pleased to have your help. Just a few notes about sort of, I know Zoom can be challenging, but just a few notes about how we might want to make it a little more painless. Move around, lay down, turn off your camera as needed. Different modes of participation are welcome. You can respond verbally, you can respond in the chat. Pause when you need to pause. Um, if we could just try to pay attention to the chat, that might be a way that we can allow people to participate if they're not wanting to speak up. Mic's muted unless you're speaking. Um, we'll try to provide visual descriptions when we can, take breaks when you need to take breaks. Again, turn cameras off when you need to, when moving devices. So that's just a list we like to share. Is there anything else I haven't said that people want to add to that list? If not, it's fine. Okay, we would like to record this event. If there are any objections, please let me know. Um, we did a little go around at the beginning. It seems like people were okay with that. If you're not, just shoot me a private message or speak up here. But we're gonna assume that if we don't hear from folks, it's okay. Um, okay, so we are here to talk about emblems of solidarity, the ways that buttons are really important pieces of media that tell all sorts of history, including labor history. And I want to start by just introducing our main presenter and giving us a chance to very quickly go around and share who we are too. So Isaac Silver brings stories from social justice movements to life in a unique and engaging way, using items from his vast archive of pinback buttons to teach people's history from the grassroots level. A Chicago-based activist, collector, and historian, he spent over 2 decades as a participant and leader in causes ranging from opposing war, police brutality, and the death penalty to building solidarity with union drives and strikes and supporting immigrants organizing for justice. This lifelong commitment has driven home the importance of learning from past generations and looking for unique vantage points and intersections of issue. A common thread in all his presentations is the capacity of everyday people to change their circumstances and make history through collective action. Okay, so we're gonna do a quick go around. We want to keep this really brief, so just say your name, preferred pronouns, mine are she, her, and then maybe just one sentence about what brought you here today, and like if you have any labor affiliation of any kind, if you're a member of a union, worker center, anything like that. So I'm just gonna call on people to make it go faster. Amy Sager, could you kick us off, please?
Yes, I can do that. Can you hear me okay? Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Stager. I use she, her pronouns. I'm here because I work with Sarah at Workday Magazine and the Labor Education Service, and I'm also really interested in telling stories about labor history in fun and engaging ways. So I'm really excited to hear more. Should I'll coordinate to
I'll
someone?
just call
Okay.
folks to make it quicker. Carter, we'll go to you, please.
Hi, I'm Carter Wright. I work in the communications department of the Service Employees International Union, and I actually, have to think of words to put on buttons. So, am curious about the history and context, looking for inspiration and stories.
That's really
Thanks.
cool. Thank you. Hosea?
Hey, I'm Josiah. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a part of IATSE, Local 745 here in Minnesota. And I love buttons. I love sort of any like union merchandising. Maybe not the right word, but and especially like throwback vintage stuff. Awesome. So yeah, pumped to listen in.
Awesome, thanks. Gabe. You mentioned you're on a bus. It's okay if you can't chip in right now. I'll go to Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel. Pronouns are she, her. I am not currently in a union, but I have been in the past. I'm also currently a member of New York City DSA. So I'm interested in organizing, and I am also just interested in like the sort of visual, like interesting and new ways to learn history, particularly through like visual mediums. So this just seemed like something cool. I saw it in Blue Sky and signed up to take it.
Oh my gosh, that's so cool. Thank you for being here. Rocky?
Hi, everyone. Sorry for being late. Rocky, I work here at the Labor Education Service, so I get to be coworker to Sarah Lazar and Amy Stager. I think those are the only two from LES here right now, right? Oh, okay. Yeah, and any pronouns are good. I'm very excited. What was the question? Because I was late.
Oh, any like labor affiliation, union, worker center?
I mean, I work here at Labor Education Service, so I'll leave it at that. And used to be an apprentice with the Carpenters Union in 1644. All right, I'll pass it to.
I've got it. I'm just calling them something.
Okay, all right, sweet.
Deborah put a chat that they're driving but glad to be here. And I think last we have Nadja. If you're speaking, we can't hear you, but it's okay if you can't talk either.
Hi, I'm Nadia. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry for mispronouncing your name.
Oh, no worries. It's all right. And pronouns she, her. And I collect a lot of vintage. A lot of my collection is labor based. So I'm really interested in learning more about the imagery.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Isaac, I will kick it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, and everybody. Nice to meet you. This is my first time attempting to present a slideshow on Zoom, so bear with me. Hopefully it goes well. Is that working?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay. Um, so this talk today I'm going to do is a little bit of a combination of talk that I've delivered a couple of times to United Auto Workers members, UAW members at their conference center in Michigan, and then also a presentation that I did at a local high school recently. So um, I'm looking forward to sharing and also hearing other folks' reflections and ideas afterwards. So the this is a presentation that's based on an exhibit that I created a couple of years ago called Emblems of Solidarity. That is a physical display of four 2 by 4 foot shadow boxes, which each of which contain mostly buttons, but other small ephemera connected to the history of organizing in several different industries and the development of industrial unions in those. So this is kind of a companion piece to a physical exhibit as well. This is a little bit of what we're going to be um, talking about today. We've already done the introductions, um, but I'm going to sort of go through some background just on how I got into collecting buttons and why I think that that's important and some of the different aspects of them that people may or may not have thought about that these items have to communicate. Um, and then give sort of like a guided tour about some of the highlights that are in each of the display cases in that exhibit. So I have been active in a variety of movements, like Sarah mentioned, going back about 25 years now. So this photo of me at the top left is um, an and from the days when we didn't take as many pictures of ourselves as now, but you can see I'm wearing buttons there. That's me and my friend Sarah, who were anti-war activists in Atlanta, Georgia, where I'm from. And from the onset of my time organizing around different in different movements, a role that I've often played is both designing but also distributing materials which are considered ephemeral after they're used, like leaflets, wheat pasting posters, creating buttons and distributing them. but that are actually really essential tools for organizing. And early on, I remember that a mentor of mine who had been active, for decades previously, emphasized that it's often the stuff that's preserved as kind of historical relics in organizing and in people's history, like the manifestos, the famous speeches, and so forth, are actually a small part of the story, and in fact, not the one that most of us um, engaged with in our day-to-day lives as rank and file union members, as activists and grassroots organizations, and so forth. So I currently for work, I am a handyman. I do home repair. I've been had a whole range of jobs and different menial jobs, ranging from a hotel bellhop to warehouse working to sorting mail at the post office. And then there's a picture of me um, as a union bricklayer for a while as well, prior to my current job. And so I think that my vantage point, like I just described, is one of I'm not a professional, I'm not a trained historian, I'm not a trained archivist. And the origin of this collecting practice that I have initially began as somewhat of a hobby, but also I think even at the onset, I did feel a calling to preserve and archive in an informal sense these artifacts of our history because it's something that I could just feel was important. And when I would have my own collection of items that I had been connected to, then became augmented by different friends and mentors who would say, "Oh, hey, I have a box of this stuff too. Do you want to look through it, want to take any of it?" And that grew over time to the point when I had a collection of several hundred buttons, which seemed like a lot then. It no longer seems like a lot because it was at that point that I decided to turn this into more of an ongoing project and something that would comprehend as comprehensively as possible paint a picture of different organizing that has happened over the past century plus through the format of ephemeral items. And then this bottom picture of me on this slide is with a blown up picture of the exhibit in the background presenting at the one of the auto workers conferences um, earlier this year. So I want to start off with a little bit of a background of like buttons as a medium. And although they seem really simple, one of the questions that I often get is, what's the oldest button that you have? And the answer for me and anybody who collects buttons is never going to be earlier than 1896, because even though these are really simple devices, they were not invented until 1896. Um, Prior to that, there were other objects which served a similar purpose. So I have a picture of a few of those which are in my collection from the 19th century, like this little token from the abolitionist movement. Can people see my um, uh, cursor or no? No? Okay, well, that's fine. Um, so there were things like
And see your cursor.
you
Sorry.
can see it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I thought you were shaking it. Yeah, so there's like this token, there's this medallion that was worn by members of the mine workers union. There's this pendant from the 8 Hour Day movement that would have been worn around the neck. But all of these, you can tell, are a little bit more delicate and fragile. This is not something that you're going to wear uh, to work at the mine. It was used more ceremonially um, at a parade or a union function when people would not be in their work clothes, but sort of dressed up. Uh-oh. Um, and so the innovation of buttons was that they are cheap, quick to produce, can spread a can convey a message very easily, and can be worn on anything. So at the time that these were created in the late 19th century, it was something of a cultural revolution, really. There's of course not just buttons that are used for political and labor causes, but there were um, things related to cultural products, advertising, different fraternal and other types of organizations, joke buttons, and so forth. And something that's important to keep in mind is that a lot of personal markers of identity and communication that we are used to now, like an embroidered baseball cap or a screen printed t-shirt or even an adhesive sticker, were decades away from being invented. So at this time, if you wanted to spread a message walking around in your day-to-day life or a marker of your personal identity or anything like that, for a couple of generations, pinback buttons were it. So they were really important. And another aspect is thinking of why they were important is thinking about what was happening in the world at this time in the late 19th century. So the origins of the current U.S. labor movement, the founding of the American Federation of Labor, also coincides approximately with the invention of pinback buttons. The spread of the women's suffrage movement and the expansion of political participation and enfranchisement also roughly coincides. The appearance or the expansion of the immigrant working class, the rapid growth of cities, uh, the beginnings of lots of cultural developments like movies and recorded music, and even the segmentation of the population into distinct generations. All of that was happening around the late 19th century, early 20th century. And so, really, all of these developments are kind of inseparable and intertwined with pinback buttons. And it's for that reason that they can be such a universal kind of artifact for all of the developments that happened since then. So specifically labor buttons, one aspect of them that uh, drew me to them is that these serve as a kind of family heirloom. Like a lot of people in your family, you might remember your ancestors through a quilt or their that they made, or tools that they used, or old photographs. And these are a kind of a collective history for our shared working class big family. Secondly, something that I always emphasize whenever I do a presentation or an exhibit is that although it has the appearance currently of being a pretty sterile museum display, uh, there are items in every exhibit that I have created which people, for wearing them at the time, were fired, blacklisted from their industry, deported from the country or threatened with deportation, beaten up, and in some cases even killed. If people are familiar with the famous Lawrence textile strike, where the labor slogan, bread and roses, originates, there were a number of fatalities where workers were killed for participating in that strike. But the final one actually occurred months after the conclusion of the strike, when a worker refused to take off his union pin and was followed home and beaten to death in his backyard from a bar. And so it poses the question, why were these little, half-inch emblems so dangerous and threatening? And the simplest explanation for that is that by wearing a button, one transforms from an individual who has relatively little power against employers and the government and other, you know, um, powerful forces, and into part of a collective organization or movement that actually has a chance of fighting back. And so that's something that is deeply threatening to those power structures. So here are some examples of, a range of buttons from different times and sort of different purposes. Um, and again, the innovation that pinback buttons provided was, because they're cheap and easy to produce, they were something that could be used as a tool for the labor movement. So that mine workers medallion that I showed earlier, like I mentioned, it's not something that could be worn day to day at work. It wouldn't be able to identify a a really enthusiastic supporter of the union in a mine. It would only be for more of a ritual and ceremonial use. Whereas these are something that can be passed out on a picket line at the factory gates, worn into work, and so forth. So here's just a range of different striking images. This is from the high school art classes that I guest taught that I was a guest teacher for last month. Um, but there's a different way of looking at them as well. So um, in this array of maybe 10 or 12 buttons, and even if it was bigger, if it was 100, or if it was in my entire collection of thousands of buttons, I assert that there are three main types of buttons, that all buttons would fall into one of these three categories. Ones that are educational, in other words, their purpose is to raise awareness about a slogan or an idea, full stop. That's the entire purpose of the button, or the main purpose. There's others which are a call to action. So the audience isn't the general public and trying to raise awareness or the general population of a workplace, um, but trying to unite people to take common action, whether that's going on strike, walking a picket line, attending a demonstration, voting a certain way, contributing to a fundraising call, or so forth. And then finally, there are buttons which are organizational, which identify people as a member of an organization, such as a union or a union organizing committee, or having a specific role in that. So, um, like a shop steward would be a great example of this. And these are these organizational buttons are what are called dues pins, which used to play a really important role in the labor movement. And we're going to look more specifically at some of those varieties of dues pins a little bit later in the presentation. But getting back to the exhibit that this is based on, the title that I chose, Emblems of Solidarity, is actually a quote that comes from a meatpacking worker in Iowa or Minnesota, Arthur Kampfer. And there's a lot of oral histories of participants in the big industrial organizing drives of the 1930s. And across the board, regardless of industry, it was frequently the case that people will refer to the role that buttons played. And so this guy, he talked about how the stage of the organizing drive in the meatpacking plant at which he started to wear a button openly, he had felt like an animal going into work, or like a dog or something like that. And then afterwards, he felt like a man or a human. And he referred to it as an emblem of solidarity. Uh, there's another important anecdote that's very revealing about the use of buttons in specifically in the meatpacking industry, which is one of the three that this exhibit focused on. There is a story in Chicago, in the Chicago stockyards, where a black shop steward, union leader, persistently wore a shop steward button on the shop floor in the meatpacking plant prior to the contract being signed. And one day he was asked to take it off and was fired, which ended up triggering what's called a wildcat strike, an unauthorized strike where all the workers walked out and shut down the plant. And so I thought that that's a really important example of the way that unions worked for a couple of reasons. One is that it was a symbol of union power versus boss power on the shop floor. And secondly, the fact that in this industry, like all industries, but especially meatpacking was one where there had been really bitter racial divisions amongst the workers. And so this was a case that showed the progress that had been made by the Packing House Workers Organizing Committee um, at foregrounding interracial unionism and black leadership, where you had this case where a black leader of the union on the shop floor was threatened with firing, and everybody, black and white and Mexican and other nationalities, walked out having his back. And so it was about the button, but it was really about much more. Um, so a second example that comes from another industry that this exhibit highlights, which is the auto industry. In uh, in the formation of the United Auto Workers, the final frontier of of their attempts to organize the auto industry was Ford, which was the Ford River Rouge plant was in the 1930s the largest uh, industrial facility in the world. There were close to 100,000 workers, and it was in essentially a company town where armed company goons patrolled the shop floor, the um, and the parking lots. They had company newspapers circulating in the town. They paid preachers to spread anti-union messages on Sundays. And so it was really seen as a dictatorial bastion of anti-union ideology. And when that finally began to be organized after GM and Chrysler, the other two companies of the so-called Big Three, um, there was a labor journalist who was describing this process, and a quote that stuck out to me is, thousands and thousands of men at Ford are now union. Union men under union instructions have entered the hellish gates of the Ford empire, wearing union caps and union buttons. How different things are now than 6 months ago. A wave of unionism has engulfed River Rouge. And so this is before the famous Battle of the Overpass clash between company agents and union supporters. It was before the contract was signed, but it really indicated that the union had arrived because a huge percentage of the workforce was ready and willing to stick their neck out and indicate their allegiance to the union drive. And that was what's now called a structure test that demonstrated the progress that had been made. And here's another item from my collection, which is actually one of those very caps from the River Rouge facility. And you can see it has all of the dues buttons on there, tracing the months that this member was involved with the union and paying dues. Final example from the third main industry that the exhibit, or wait, there's two more. This one from actually from Minneapolis, where there was a very important strike in the trucking industry in 1934. This was an organizing drive that grew exponentially over spring of 1934, and by May had erupted into uh, almost the verge of a general strike, including all the workers in the city. But it was centered on the central market area. Their goal as a truck drivers union was to halt all traffic in the city that wasn't flowing without their permission. And so the trucking companies, anti-union organizations, and the police had uh, formed basically armed battalions resisting this, deputized anti-union uh, individuals in a group called the Citizens League. And there is a quote from a history of one of the leaders of that strike named Farrell Dobbs that said in May 1934, with a mass of picketers engaged in heated combat against a large body of police and deputies, personal features could not serve as marks of identity. The strikers wore union buttons, the cops were in uniform, and the deputies had special police badges pinned onto their civilian clothing. These were and had to be the only ready means of distinguishing friend from foe in the fast-moving battle. So this is a case that's very literally what I spoke of earlier, where individuals had transformed from just being one person into part of a collective body. And even though they were otherwise anonymous and unknown to one another, people were indicating which side they were on by which button they were wearing in those street battles. Final example, the third panel of the exhibit is on the logistics or shipping industry. So that's including over-the-road truck drivers, but also maritime workers and longshore workers. In Hawaii, which people think of as a place to vacation, but it actually has a really militant and rich history of labor struggle as well. Historically, up until the 1950s, was basically a big sugar plantation. All the islands were essentially owned by a handful of companies that had vertical integration going from uh, the sugar and fruit plantations on up to financial institutions and the shipping docks and literally owning the ships and so forth. And there had been repeated efforts by the workers to organize there, which were foiled by the old story of ethnic divisions that were very deliberately stoked by those owners. So they had some segments of the plantation workforce who were native Hawaiian, some were Japanese, others Korean, Portuguese, and Filipino, and would give workers of different ethnicities different qualities and locations of housing, different jobs, and really do everything they could to try to stoke those divisions. And it worked because all of the efforts to organize were ethnically based and able to be broken by bringing in strike breakers of different ethnicities. Until the end of World War II, there was a Hawaii-wide sugar strike in fall of 1946. And so the bosses said, well, we know what to do. We're going to um, bring in some strike breakers from the Philippines, like we always have. However, by that point, this union, which organized the sugar plantations, the ILWU, was connected by virtue of being a waterfront union to a whole alliance of Pacific maritime unions, including sailors' unions, who were working on those boats um, that were bringing the Filipino strike breakers over to the Hawaiian Islands. And so on over the course of the journey, um, the maritime union unionized sailors explained what was going on, that they were brought in to be strike breakers. And so there's really wonderful stories of when these workers stepped off the docks uh, onto the Hawaiian Islands. They were all wearing these buttons already. And it indicated that the efforts to break the strike would ultimately fail. And all of the accounts just say that the bosses face, went pale, like, oh shit, our secret weapon was turned against us. So I love that story. Unfortunately, there's not a specific quote like in the other cases. So now moving on to like a more comprehensive view of each of these industries. This is a version. The exhibit has now changed a little bit, but this is version 1.0 that I prepared for the Labor Notes conference a couple of years ago. And my mindset or my goal in selecting which stories to tell were that in the United Auto Workers, in the UFCW, which is the Food Workers Union, Food and Grocery Workers Union, and in the Teamsters, each of those have some new life and some new rank and file energy. And I was anticipating at that conference that there would be young workers just getting involved in their union, just becoming aware of the broader labor movement. And this would be a useful way of acquainting them with the story of the rise and sometimes the fall and decline of of their organizations that they belong to. So each of the frames is arranged roughly chronologically, with little clusters of buttons and other items corresponding to aspects of the story of that union. And with the UAW frame in particular, something that is really important to realize about um, the UAW as the industry that has historically represented the auto industry is that that's an industry that went from being nothing at the turn of the 20th century to by the 1930s and the following decades being one which directly or within 1 degree of separation employed over 10% of the entire US workforce. And so therefore everything that happened in it, all of the labor standards, all of the wage standards and everything else had a huge impact on the entire working class. Um, and that is eventually the role that the UAW played for much of the 20th century was as kind of like a core of the organized labor movement in the United States. But before that was the case, there's this early section which uh, I find quite interesting, and probably in some ways, more relevant to us today, given the various weaknesses of the labor movement, union density today is probably about as low as it was in the late 20s, early 30s, if not lower. Um, Similar to that time, many of the approaches that we've learned of how to organize at work are outdated and frequently get um, beaten back. And so this early stage of what became, wait, da, 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 da. What became the UAW, um, you notice there's a variety of unions. There's the Automotive Industrial Workers Association, which was in Detroit. There's the Wisconsin Industrial Union Local 1, which was a farm implement union in Wisconsin. There were these various what were called federal labor unions in other parts of the industrial Midwest that were just a local for all the workers at a particular factory. And then there's unions for unemployed organizations and hunger marches, the Mechanics Educational Society. And this was kind of the background of the formation of the UAW. It was networks of mostly younger workers who were communicating with each other and in touch and really inventive, really eager to try new strategies and particular to overcome the legacy of craft unionism, which had been an exclusive model that said that in order to belong to a union, you had to have a particular skill, have gone through an apprenticeship. Uh, and this is something that was pretty much irrelevant in a lot of these mass production industries. And so these little networks of young, militant, often radical workers um, were seeking a more inclusive and participatory model of unionism, but without a guidebook. And so there's if you read the accounts of their stories, it'll be very much in some ways reminiscent to the spirit that today animates Starbucks worker organizing, for example, where people are doing little potluck dinners, or there's a picket in another city and people get in a car caravan and drive from Toledo, from Detroit down to Toledo or up to Flint, and sort of like rally on every little spark in an effort to make something bigger. Um, and in particular, my view of the UAW was really influenced by this one memoir of a worker who started out in the plants in the late teens, and then by the 1930s had lung damage that was too bad from metal dust. And he ended up going on the education department of the union, but he had a really um, illuminating view of what auto workers at this time were thinking. So, oh, oop, doubled up. Oh yeah, yeah. So now I'm now I remember why I put this here. So yeah, we're calling um, this hat with an array of union buttons from the organization of the Ford River Rouge plant um, introduces us to the idea of dues buttons as a tool, which I referred to earlier. And this is the class that I taught to high school students was very focused on dues buttons. And so you can see these are all from the UAW, and we'll look at specifically UAW dues buttons in a moment. Um, but in looking at different historical dues buttons, um, you find recurring over and over again some different types of graphics. So what these were used for is in the days before dues checkoff, where currently most members who belong to a union, it's directly deducted from your paycheck, and it's almost like a subscription to Netflix or something. Prior to that, prior to what's called dues checkoff, union members had to manually pay dues at a meeting or to a union representative at work. And in exchange, they had a little booklet and would get that stamped and then get a dues pin to wear, showing that they were paid up and current in their dues, which were either monthly, sometimes quarterly, sometimes yearly. Um, so these are literal indications of belonging to a union, but they also have a symbolic value. And so I spoke earlier about the distinction between um, uh, da, 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 between craft and industrial unionism. So this one on the top left, red with a red circle with cream center, is an example of a craft union button. So this is the Amalgamated Meat Cutters and Butcher Workmen of North America Union, which was the craft union in the meat production industry. In the early 20th century. And you can see that what's really highlighted are butcher's tools. So there's a butcher knife, there's a bone saw, and it's emphasizing that the meaning of that union was very focused on skilled craftspeople who had completed a union apprenticeship, owned their own tools, um, and were not actually representative of what by the 1930s were the majority of workers in the meat industry. People who were maybe just doing one standard cut over and over again on an assembly line, or sweeping guts off the floor, or moving a cut of meat into the freezer, or driving an animal, into the plant or something like that. These small, less skilled, more easily replaceable uh, roles which were organized industrially by the Packing House Workers Organizing Committee and eventually what became the United Packing House Workers of America. And so you see this 1945 dues pin focuses um uh uh-oh. Oh, cool. Sorry, I just noticed that there's a chat window, which I was not seeing. So this is an example of a button for an industrial union where it can't focus on tools because workers are using all different kinds of tools. What's uniting them is the production process. And so, although the artwork isn't particularly great, what is indicated here is the final product of the work, which is a cut of meat. And this is something that was also the case for the auto workers. Then a few other examples is you have this Teamsters button where it's referencing the history of the job. So it's a truck drivers union, but historically was one where there's horse heads for the logo um, because Teamsters literally meant people who drove a team of horse or maybe even oxen to pull a cart. Um, then there are buttons like this textile worker button here which are focused not so much on the type of work at all, but the ideals of unionism. So unity and solidarity. And there's oftentimes a handshake or a raised fist or other things which indicate some kind of ideological commitment. And then finally, there's dues buttons, which emphasize the location that the work is done. So for port workers, sometimes you'll have a picture of a ship being unloaded, or in this case, timber workers. This is for loggers in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. You have their tools, but then you also have trees because they had a mobile workplace. You're not always going to the same factory or the same office to work, but to the forest generally. So where is my um, so looking at the specific having covered that background, um, what I find fascinating about the evolution of UAW dues buttons, which kind of communicates something about the evolution of the union itself, is if you look in the top left, this 1936 dues button, and then in the bottom right, um, there is quite a notable difference. Like I mentioned, this is the first time I've done something on Zoom, so I don't know if it's as simple as in an actual class to see, like if anybody wants to call out what are some of the differences that you notice. Like what are some of the distinctions you notice between 1936 and 1970?
The
Maybe.
aesthetics.
Oh, go ahead.
You
Rocky.
go. You go.
No, no, no. Rocky, you go. I've already talked more than you.
Okay. Hi, this is Rocky. Well, less words.
Mhm.
It looks, yeah. That's all I say for now. Aesthetics.
Okay, less words. less illustrations. The newer ones don't look as busy. Those are all true. Um, One of the questions that I asked, well, both at auto workers and high school students, is looking at buttons, looking at dues buttons. What can you tell about the type of workers or the work that's being done by those workers by looking at the buttons that are so for the 1970, if you are not all fellow labor historians and didn't kind of know what the UAW is, what would be your guess about what this indicates? Someone says you don't really know. And yeah, I think that that's true. These are much busier at the beginning, which do indicate something about just changing graphic design, you know, themes in the 30s versus the 70s. But it also kind of tells the story of the evolution of a union, which was at the beginning was had a really strong emphasis on the workplace. In the 1930s, like famous UAW leader Walter Reuther, one of the first actions that he was involved with that brought him and his brothers to prominence was they would stage, this was based on something that had actually happened, but then theatrically stage fainting from exhaustion due to the speed up on the line. And then workers would do a little quickie wildcat strike to get it slowed down. And that was typical of the UAW in the early years, as it was really focused on um, workplace issues, on health and safety and speed up conditions in the plants. Um, and again, it was about production of the solidarity and production of the automobile is what is communicated to me in this button. It talks about automobile workers. There's a picture of a car, and there's that handshake of solidarity. And as time went on, it expanded. The jurisdiction of the UAW expanded to include aviation and farm implement workers, agricultural implement workers. So you have a tractor and an airplane added in the 1940s. And then after World War II, and it's kind of interesting because you have this full logo then recedes into the background, and you have the car is still there, but it's joined by other similar industries. And then it sort of recedes into this almost like a hieroglyph, where you can barely tell that this is a tractor and this is a plane and this is a car. Um, but it's just becoming really symbolic. And then that continues in the 60s until ultimately 1970. The distinction between UAW here and, say, IBM or uh, HBO or any other kind of or CIA or any other of these like big bureaucratic acronym entities isn't exactly clear to the viewer. Uh, and that speaks to the relationship a different relationship that workers had to the union in the 1930s versus the 1970s, where it was seen more as something um, that was providing uh, benefits and undertaking political action and delivering really good benefits and wages, but relatively had much less of a presence on the shop floor to the extent that there were waves of rank and file movements that emerged in protest of that. And the piece in the middle of that is interesting. There's this little detour in the 1950s where the dues pin um, is showing this kind of caricature of a worker literally outside of the plant. And that's at the point when Reuther and other leaders of the union were really emphasizing um, strong contracts that delivered wages and benefits, but were relatively indifferent to conditions in the workplace. And you find that represented where that it's literally about, here's an auto worker who perhaps has company-sponsored health insurance for his family, can afford a cabin up north, um, and vacations in the summertime and so forth. But the conditions in the workplace are absolutely awful, and the union had sort of negotiated that bargain. And so even something as simple as a dues pen says something about the type of unionism and what these organizations mean. So let me see. I'm as I was concerned, I'm talking perhaps a little bit too long. But let me go on to this next section, which was on food workers, both meatpacking workers as well as farm workers. Um, and this is something I mentioned earlier, is an industry that historically into the present day has always been extremely diverse in terms of ethnicities, and languages spoken, and so forth. Um, and also like the auto industry, something that by the 1930s, in which the old craft union model of organization was totally, was pretty irrelevant. Um, and unfortunately, this is also an example of a of an industry that shows the huge changes that can be, that are possible through unionism, but also the decline, because in many cases the conditions both in the fields and in meat packing plants has slid back and regressed to pretty similar to what it was at the early 20th century, after a period in which these provided more stable and relatively higher wage employment. So let me see. A couple little highlights I wanted to give. One is that this button on the left, SNCC, is from the Civil Rights Movement. This is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that led lunch counter sit-ins in the early 60s. And this interracial handshake emblem is something that was frequently associated with the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. When Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech, he's wearing a button for that march that has a black and white hands shaking. But that logo actually predates the civil rights movement as we understand it by a couple of decades, and it goes back to the United Packing House Workers of America, um, which was the union of the Congress of Industrial Organizations in the meatpacking industry. And again, it's a very simple graphic, but it's something that communicates that this is an organization that is foregrounding its dedication to fighting racism and promoting interracial solidarity. And that is something that had consistently foiled efforts to organize in that industry. Um, White workers had frequently fallen, uh, you know, fallen for appeals to racism. And one of the biggest efforts prior to the 1930s at organizing in the meatpacking industry was the Stockyards Labor Council in Chicago in the early 1920s. Um, and so, you, I mean, it's very straightforward, but you can literally see um, in one case it is two white hands shaking, and in another case it's not that. So if you're uh, this effort also coincided with a wave of race riots that followed World War One, and a really um, you know like uh, a reemergence of often violent racism in U.S. cities. And so in that context, failing to really foreground the importance of interracial solidarity killed all hopes of organizing. And the packing house workers in the 1930s were really innovative um, at overcoming those divisions and kind of like building a really multiracial union. So another example of this from that same slide is this is in the farm labor industry. These are buttons to encourage workers to vote for the United Farm Workers, which existed in English, in Spanish, in Tagalog, and then this one in Arabic, because there were a lot of Yemeni farm workers in California as well. So this is something that continues to the present day. I was talking with recently with folks who were involved with the University of Minnesota Teamsters strike that concluded recently. And something that was really important in that was translating union materials into all of the varied languages that workers use, which seems so basic, but lots of workers said I've been here for like 20 years, and this is the first time there's ever been anything in my language put out by the union. And so it's something that is really communicating like who is this union for? So the final frame of the exhibit is on the shipping or logistics industry. Um, and kind of one of the key lessons that is communicated by this, but really by all three of the frames, is that the history of union growth and union density in the United States. If people have seen charts of the decline of union density over the past 50 plus years, and it's this slow, uh, decline. Um, but if you rewind further back than those charts typically show, that wasn't preceded by a slow increase. And and the emphasis in recent generations on union organization has been tactics which are very good and smart of slow, patient conversations and assembling an organizing committee and all of these other types of approaches that are a pretty prolonged campaign. And those are important and necessary and relevant in times like the ones that we're living in. However, they're not really historically accurate in terms of the way that the labor movement union density has grown. Almost all of that union density that has declined in the past 60 years um, appeared or it appeared explosively in the years 1934, 1937, 1941, and 1946 when there were massive waves of strikes and organization that expanded the ranks of unions quite rapidly. And so it was not a slow incremental gain followed by slow incremental decline, but very rapid kind of explosive growth followed by chipping away by the bosses. And so that's something that's reflected in each of these displays. And then a couple of final slides, which are more about or somewhat about my like collecting uh, practice or hobby is that for the longest time, I really focused on, well, for a long time, I focused on everything. And then I realized this is ridiculous. I need to have a little bit more limited purview. And so I decided buttons. And then, and something that I appreciated about them that I alluded to at the beginning is that these are like representation of anonymous ancestors in the union movement and other progressive social struggles. And it wasn't until probably 6 or 7 years ago that I realized that while that's true, there's also other similar items that are not anonymous, that are really specific and particular items that are sort of like a form of working class biography. And these tend to be paper. Um, so you have a few examples of these where I mentioned, along with dues pens, people would get their union books stamped. So here's an ILWU, International Longshore and Warehouse Union booklet where they have received their monthly stamps for paying their dues. And then there's also a stamp about which meetings this member went to and when they voted. Sometimes there will also be stamps about contributions made to organizing drives, solidarity with other unions, support for political prisoners. Um, and all types of different activities that otherwise completely forgotten workers would not have preserved about their lives. These two cards show that this individual participated in the in West Coast strikes that were formative for that union and a lockout in 1938. That was about the transformation of the union from just a longshore to also a warehouse um, union. And so that's something else that's really fascinating and almost like holy to me about this hobby is it's a way of bringing to light the stories of people who are much like certainly like myself. I don't want to speak to anybody else on the call people who are like rank and file participants in movements who will probably not be written about in history books ourselves, um, other than perhaps as a throwaway reference, but are really the people who do make history. Um, and one final example of this is that as I've sought things out, um, there's some cases, it's a little bit like my understanding as an outsider of what archaeology might be like, where archaeologists in some cases identify, they know that something happened somewhere. They know, or they have a pretty good idea that if you dig in a place, you might find remnants of a city or of a dinosaur or whatever they're looking for. Um, and then in other cases, um, and so there's equivalents to that where there are episodes from labor history that I'm familiar with, and I figure that there's probably going to be a button that represents that. So this is a case where the Minneapolis Teamsters, who were frequently in conflict with the much more conservative International Union, were repeatedly expelled, and at one point affiliated with the CIO rather than the American Federation of Labor. And so for a time in summer of 1941, um, there was a local 544 Minneapolis Teamsters AFL as well as CIO, and so that it's written about that people would carry two buttons. Those who were really loyal to the militant and democratic traditions that had built the union would have the CIO button inside their jacket, and then were sort of forced to wear this one on the outside, but they would be able to show their true loyalties to the others. So I was like, that's so cool. I want, and eventually I finally found buttons that represented that. But then there's other cases that are more like when archaeologists will just have something pop up in a farmer or construction workers or whatever, or digging in the ground will find something and have to seek out the explanation. So this Japanese drivers union button came from an estate sale in Seattle of an older Japanese American couple who had died. And I knew it was a union button and I had no clue of what it could be. And at first, I guess there were a lot of Japanese workers on the West Coast had small truck farms, and I thought maybe this was somehow related to that. And I finally found a single paper about it, um, written by a grad student that said that there was a brief window of time where the American Federation of Labor, which had not only excluded Japanese and other Asian American workers for decades, but actually been backers of anti-Asian, xenophobic legislation and policies, felt pressure by the emergence of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which actually were genuine multiracial unions, including Asian workers on the West Coast. And so feeling that pressure, they had this very bizarre kind of like stopgap policy of creating segregated locals for Japanese workers. And so this is an example of one of those. And you can see it's local 195J, which I'm assuming the J stands for Japanese. But when you think about, unfortunately, this is from people who had recently died, so I was not able to talk to them. But in that same collection of buttons of theirs was also a union button from the United Cannery Agricultural and Packing and affiliated. It's along Yukapawa, which is a famously multiracial, women-led uh, CIO union on the West Coast. So these folks in their lifetime in the late 1930s through the 1940s, we have to assume had the experience of being excluded from the organized labor movement, belonging to a segregated local, being sent to an internment camp, and then finally belonging to um, a union that was at the forefront of progressive demands for racial and gender equality. And that's over the course, yes, and also the Campbell Soup Company in Camden, New Jersey. That is true. And in the South, in tobacco plants, there's some really fascinating history from that Union Yucapala. But just realizing the sort of threads of history that went through the lives of these individuals as represented by the union buttons that they had, for me was just really moving and kind of put a face to some of this history and thinking about what a massive shift and huge changes they had experienced over that time. So I think that might be it is. That's the end. That's the conclusion of my presentation. Um, I guess I'll say a few words quickly about buttons of the left, which is I have shifted from having a personal collection, which was, kind of my own pet project of preserving and researching this history, to then trying to share it publicly through presentations like this one, creating exhibits, um, doing classroom appearances, and working with unions and community organizations. I also have a social media presence, but it's kind of an evolving project. So I appreciate you all coming to listen and discuss today. And I very much want to be in touch and see how else these kinds of materials can be used to bring labor history alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. That was great. Would you want to stop sharing your screen so that we can all just see
I
each other?
do.
Okay. Does anyone have questions or comments?
I have a question. It's also kind of a comment, but I wasn't able to make it to the button making workshop at the Eastside Freedom Library that happened recently. But I'm curious, like, how like those events have been going. Like, do you get a lot of people?
Mhm.
And it's about making new buttons for today. Yeah, what are those like?
Yeah, so this is the final of a kind of a flurry of events that have occurred over the past month and a half, one of which was in the Eastside Freedom Library in St. Paul. And that was following up one about the um, anti-nuclear movement at Carleton College, which was alongside an exhibit that they have at their campus museum. And then I did another one last week here in Chicago at UIC Latino Cultural Center, which was about the student movement uh, over the past 100 so years. And so typically, and each of those have combined some have been a combination of a display of like physical historic artifacts. So I brought to that anti-fascism button making workshop some examples of things from the 1930s, like some of the international solidarity campaigns with Republican Spain and against Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, and against Nazi Germany and so forth, as well as more, things about fighting and standing up to um, right-wing and racist authoritarianism more recently. And then did a little bit of a presentation that was, I mean, for me, this is a one thing that's kind of fun is that this becomes an excuse to learn and try to share and present some thoughts about these different histories. So that in that case it was a discussion a little bit about like what are some of the aspects of fascist and anti-fascist movements and like stimulating that thinking. And because I was coming from Chicago to Minneapolis right at the weekend when they had like ICE border patrol people there, talking a little bit about our experiences of resisting that in our city, and then followed by, having button maker materials, art supplies, and people can like make their own buttons, but have it be kind of informed and hopefully stimulated by some of the thoughts and material that I'd shared. Um, so so yeah, that's and yeah, the many of the events that I've done recently that are in person have had that those three elements of like physical materials, a more historical and theoretical kind of presentation, and then discussion slash creating. So yeah.
Cool, thank you.
Anything else?
I have a couple questions.
Mhm.
Um, do you know, are there any unions or local unions that still do the, dues collection sort of by hand and use buttons?
Yeah. Um, I think that it is I mean it's definitely uncommon. There are some I think that it's actually more common in those types of practices are more common in the building trades where it's like a little bit different context of maintaining making sure that people who are hired onto a job site are like paying union dues, and so sometimes like the steward will go around and um, check people's dues. But so there are more recent building trades dues buttons, but it is in many. I think that there's, it's a little hard to say what's been the fluctuation of the use and production of buttons, but I do, not just because I'm a nerd about this stuff, but I genuinely believe that there's a correlation between a decline in the strength and democratic practice and militancy of unions and the use of things like buttons. Um, I think that T-shirts have become a lot more common now in term, like lots of unions will do T-shirt days or like wear a certain color as a structure test and so forth. But buttons are actually are really irreplaceable in sense of being able to just like rapidly pass them out. Whatever people happen to be wearing, they can put them on. And something that's actually really helpful about buttons as a format, like a question that I've gotten that I really like is because it shows that people are looking at this in like an engaged activist way, is what are the most successful buttons historically? Like what are the ones that have been most useful in the organizing drive that they were designed for, whatever purpose they were designed for. And so, although it's a great question, I don't have an answer. It's a little hard to say, but it is something that, like some examples of buttons that I've designed, I know were very successful because I don't have example. I don't have them in my collection because we passed, people bought them all or took them all immediately, and like we used up the entire run. And so that's something that shows that the message, the visuals, whatever, is really effective, and people like haven't or like yearning to like put it on and identify with it. And so it is something that can be, there's a little bit of a communication exchange where it's not just pushing out the the message that the organizers or comms department or whoever wants to establish, but there's also feedback of like how, how ready are people to take them? How much are people wearing them? How much, like and all of that type of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, there's also, I mean, I know in my union, in a local union in particular that I worked for a while, there's a strong culture of stickers. Um,
Yeah.
and for, I mean, and it was a union of hospital workers, nurses and hospital workers mainly. And I think people just liked them because they were
Hmm.
less cumbersome to have them on your scrubs and didn't
Yeah.
get in the way of, just one snag on something while you were trying to do something at work. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
and then second question is, how big is your collection and where did you get most of the buttons or where do you typically find buttons?
I'm in the process of discovering the answer to that first question because I don't because it is constantly growing. So I mean, this isn't all I'm a volunteer for this myself. So there are other volunteers who I'm working with to try to document the full collection and eventually have it be an online searchable database that can be like reference for researchers and graphic designers and organizers and so forth. So I don't have an answer for that because I like over the course of like at that East Side Freedom Library event, um, this was great. People brought like there was like a grocery worker who designs a ton of buttons and he brought like the full run and like gave those all to me and then like another longtime friend of mine was like, yeah, I've had like all of boxes of my whole activist career of buttons going back to the 80s in my basement for forever. I figured you would make more use of it than me, so here you go. So my collection expanded by hundreds of items in that very night. So it's difficult to say, but it is I just threw out the number 10,000 items. I don't know if that's actually accurate or not, but but yeah, it's thousands and thousands of items and growing both from I mean, those are two examples of getting contemporary items. Like whenever I'm at a demonstration, whenever I meet someone, I always make a point to try to collect things. And then also, there are sometimes donations that people give of their like personal collection, and then scouring online auctions and antique stores and things like that. So it's really a variety um, of of sources and a little hard to answer, but there's like networks of button collectors. So a lot of the really historic UAW buttons that I got, for example, I there's someone who sells buttons who's in like the button collector world who said, "Hey, I just got a bunch of labor buttons. I don't know anything about them, but I know that you like labor stuff." And um he he sold me like a big shoebox full for very little money, which was incredible. And then I looked through them and it was even more incredible because it included things like a medallion that was awarded to participants of the Flint sit-down strike. There's a little badge that was given to attendees at the founding conference of the UAW, which had like 120 people at it. And I determined that I think much of that came from um, oh God, I'm now blanking on his name, but someone who was a Toledo UAW member who then wound up being one of the VPs under Walter Reuther. But the story of those items was that like, so I was like, where'd you get all this stuff? And he said, oh, I got it from this retired letter carrier in the Detroit area who collects labor stuff. And then I asked the letter carrier, where'd you get it? And he said, oh, I got it from somebody in Toledo who collects auto related stuff. So like, I don't, if, I assume it had come from the estate sale of, this one guy and then just passed into different hands. Thankfully, in a unit because that's like with those two, with the Japanese drivers union, it's really important sometimes to like know the kind of specific provenance to have a better picture of the history. So.
All right. Um, any other questions, comments? We're getting a little close to time, so it's all I'll sort of let anyone else speak up and then we might wrap. Um, all right, this has been amazing. I understand what all the buzz is about now, Isaac. This is like really mind-blowing. And I think that there were a lot of labor nerds on this meeting. So, I am hoping we're all leaving pretty satisfied. Nadia just said, I found many buttons, pins, and documents at thrift markets and estate
Mhm.
sales. Oftentimes they will be in with jewelry.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah,
true.
for sure. Yeah. So if yes, and if you did appreciate it, please feel, like I said, please reach out and follow up because I'm always looking for ways to, collaborate with different organizations and have a way to both share this, but also be of service to organizing and educational projects that are happening now is really the point of all of this. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Yeah, and Carter says a lot of us have boxes of buttons that we'll
Mhm.
eventually like to donate to somewhere where they'll be appreciated. So, well, thank you so much, Corvin. Thank you for manually transcribing this entire conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's huge,
Uh,
huge work. I really appreciate it.
yeah. Okay, everyone, thanks again for coming. We hope you'll come to our other events and definitely follow Isaac's work. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
All right, I'm just want to make sure